සුළු අපි අබ්දුල්ලාහම පටන් ගමු එයාට රෙකෝඩ් කරන්න දුන්නා.
Okay, okay.
ඉසුරු
Yes.
ඉසුරු ඔයාට පටන් ගන්න පුළුවන් මේක ඔටෝම YouTube එකේ රෙකෝඩ් වෙනවා.
Okay, okay.
හරි ඉසුරු තව දෙයක් මේ මම පොඩි හදිස්සියකට මට 11:00 වෙද්දී යන්න වෙනවා. ඒකෙන්ද ඔයා මේ මීටින් එකේ වෙනකන් ඔයා ලීව් වෙන්න එපා. ඔයාට පොස්ට් දීලා තියෙන එකයි.
Okay, all right, thank you.
හරි. හරි පටන් ගන්න.
Okay, so just before I start, I guess I'll just go through a few things. So right now we are planning to do this Kuppi series for all the modules. That means for contract, criminal, Roman, family, and equity, all of them. So before I start, I would like to say thank you, Sachin, for starting this whole thing, but thank you everyone who engaged into this as well. So who's doing it is me so far. We can all volunteer if it's possible to volunteer. So far, it's me, Gagana, we have Govindu and Abdullah. If anyone else would like to volunteer to divide the subjects between ourselves, please do. Also, I can be confusing at certain times the way that I express myself. So I do have Gagana and Saubhagya, I think, are here as well, who can translate it for you. So if there's any issue with what I'm saying, just please put to the chat or raise your hands or ask to translate. Someone will do it for you. Don't worry about it. Also, we have Kasun, Govindu, and Gagana who are fact checking me. We have Abdullah as well, who's fact checking me right now. So if I mess up, please don't worry. You can stop me there and say that was wrong, fix it, right? If anyone finds it wrong, it doesn't matter if they're those fact checkers or not. Just say you're wrong there, okay? Also, I would prefer if people don't move the whiteboard a bit. Okay, right. So I'll be doing contract today, specifically elements of a contract. Now you guys might have figured out, please don't move. That contract law is the most confusing one, I would say, because it is a 4 credit one. But we are dividing this between ourselves and doing it. Just for clarity's sake, I'm going to go through the entire syllabus and tell you what each part is about. Just so like we are not confused here, right? So what I'm starting off with is the elements of a contract. That's the first part, right? On the elements of a contract, we are dealing with what is included with, like, what is required for a valid contract to be made. So under it, there are 5 things that we discuss. We discuss offer, acceptance, consideration, intention, and capacity. Obviously, elements you guys like are a bit okay with, considering the assignment was from this, but I'll still go through all of them. Then we're talking about terms of a contract. So terms is what is in the contract. Now, before we talk about what is required for a contract to be made, for a contract to be considered a contract, in terms, we talk about what is inside the contract. What sort of implications do those things have? So, for instance, if it is a condition, what sort of obligation does that create? If it's a warranty, what sort of an obligation does that create? So, we are just talking about what is in the contract for terms. Then we talk about vitiating factors. Vitiating factors are basically factors which can make contracts a defect, right? So when the contract is a defect, that means the contract is sort of like broken. In that instance, the contract, two ways of, like, there are two results of it. One, it can be void, or it can be void. Don't worry, I'll be teaching all of this, right? Or someone else will. When it is void, it was invalid from the very beginning. But when it's voidable, it was sort of invalid, but it is up to the parties to decide whether they want to continue the contract or not. So let's take, for instance, the first one, which is a mistake. Now, if there is a mistake contract, both parties think of two different things, right? So we have party A, let's divide this like this. We have party A and we have party B. A thinks the car is black color, right? So he thinks the car is black, and part of the car, buy a good model of this car. The color of it wasn't a big deal, but it was both of the mistake. B thinks A wants a red car. A actually wanted a black car. Now there is a mistake here. There's an error in this entire thing. So what it matters here is does the error make this contract void, or does the error make this contract voidable? Voidable means it's fine. If A thinks, you know what, I'll deal with a red car, it's voidable. But it's void if it was such a big deal that A does not want to go forward with this contract. So just it's not a big part, but it is kind of an important part because you do get questions from vitiating. Something is void or voidable. Discharge of contract. Now, first, when we talk about vitiating factors, we are talking about does the contract become void or voidable? But discharge, we talk about the termination of it or the contract ending. So, what are the ways a contract can end? Either it can end because it naturally ended. Both parties did their obligations. You gave me the money, I gave you the car, contract over. Or we can agree to end the contract early. For instance, there was some sort of a contract between two parties to provide food, and then there was some sort of a flood that happened. So then party A realized, you know what, I can't get the food from this guy. It's fine, we'll end the contract, right? He's in a bad situation, I'm in a bad situation, we might as well end it. So they agree to end the contract. Another way is a breach, where one party does not do what they were supposed to do in the contract, right? They refuse to do their part of the duty. So then there's a breach and the contract can end. Finally, there's frustration. Things completely out of your control happen. So an example is there's a contract to book a hall, and the hall goes like the hall burns the night before. There's a fire, the hall burns down. Like it's no party, it's not a breach. It's not an agreement. It hasn't been performed, but still it can't be performed. That's what frustration is. So discharge or the termination of a contract can happen because of these 4 reasons. Can you reduce the speed? Yes, can. Then we go into remedies. Remedies are basically when the contract was breached, what sort of a relief can the parties go for? If one party breaks the contract, what can the other party go for? So usually under common law, we did this when we were doing equity, by the way. Under common law, the usual response is damages, right? Let's pay that done something wrong, you have not kept the promise, you have to pay that other person because you have to compensate him. So you have damages usually. But when we look at the equitable remedies, we do have things like specific performance, injunctions, and rescissions. I don't think these three topics require to be covered, but I think if we do have time, we will do it. But damages will be covered, okay? Right. So what we are going to be doing today, okay, I'm really sorry. I will go as slow as possible. I'm generally a fast-speaking person. Very sorry about that. Okay. So what I'm planning on doing today is offer, acceptance, intention, and capacity. I will try to do consideration, but that depends on how much time is left. But I will be doing these four. So I'll be doing those with case laws. Again, if I go fast randomly, stop me and tell me that's too fast. It's just a bad habit at this point. Okay. We'll start with the elements of a contract, but before we go into elements, let's first look at what is a contract, okay? 1 second while this whiteboard loads. Yes, surely. So I don't think I can finish elements today, but let's see, okay? Terms are going to be done by Abdullah, by the way. And as far as we have planned so far, vitiating factors will be done again. Okay, we'll start with what is a contract. Now, a contract, you can't say is an agreement because that's like part of it. You know what an agreement is, right? One party says something, the other party agrees to it, there's an agreement. But that's not fully what a contract is. A contract requires an intention of creating legal rights and also enforceability by the law. If I give the simplest definition for what a contract is, it is an agreement which is legally enforceable, right? Let me write that down. Agreement which is legally enforceable. Legally enforceable. What does that mean? We have agreements in our everyday life, right? You will agree to your friend to buy them a lunch packet at 10:30. That's an agreement. But that is not a legally enforceable agreement, is it? No, because you are just making that and you're saying, you know what, I'll buy you one. So at a certain point, some agreements can become legally enforceable. So to be legally enforceable, there are certain elements that it has to satisfy. And once those elements are satisfied, we say an agreement converts into a contract. So we are talking about those elements, right? What are the elements required for an agreement to turn into a contract? So these are other definitions that we have of what a contract is. And I think this is the easiest definition to go with. But if you do want like a binding source, a good quote, you can go for one of these two. But they're saying the same thing, right? An agreement which creates legal obligations. Or this one says a contract is a promise which is mutually exchanged between promiser and promisees, the duty and performance, blah, blah, blah. This is a very long definition. You don't need that. I think we can stick to this small definition, which is an agreement with the intention of creating legal rights and obligations, which is enforced by the law. Okay. If I confused you, please let me know in the chat. Right. So I said, when you satisfy certain elements, an agreement becomes a contract. So what are those elements? Firstly, we should have the agreement in the first place. What is included within an agreement? We have two parts. We have offer and we have acceptance. Now, for it to be a valid contract, there are certain things that you should satisfy for it to be a proper offer, and there are certain things you need to satisfy for it to be a proper acceptance, right? It can't just be a simple offer and a simple acceptance. Again, in order to be a contract, there are still conditions, right? Then you should have intention. Intention in the sense to be legally bound. Now, let's take, for instance, a mother promises the child and says, I will get you I will get you a really new pencil case if you get 95 for your maths exam. There is no intention to be legally bound, right? Like the mother won't think, oh, yes, my son will go to court the next day if I don't get this purse, right? There is no expectation that there is a legal right or a legal duty. You are just making an agreement. So, in that sense, certain, like if you have an intention to be legally bound only, does an agreement become a contract? Next, we have consideration. Now, consideration is the English law version of it. So, consideration is basically an exchange of value, right? So, for there to be a contract, it's not I agree to do this and you agree to do this, right? Under English law, I agree to do this and I give you something. You agree to do this and you give me something. It's something along those lines. Let's take, for instance, someone agreeing to paint your house or getting into a contract to paint the house. You will promise to give him money. He will promise to paint the house. That's consideration, right? Promising to paint the house is a detriment. That is, he's losing something. He's losing his time, his energy, paint, whatever, right? He's losing something. I am gaining something, which is I get my house painted, but I'm also losing something because I have to pay. So there is a value exchange, and that is what we call consideration. Consideration is under English law. Under the RTL, which is Roman Dutch law, we have another version of it called justa causa, right? What is the difference between consideration and justa causa? Consideration looks at a value exchange which can be defined on a monetary level. What does that mean? I can decide that this was this expensive. So, for instance, let's go back to the same example we had before, painting the house. When you're painting my house, you can define it with money, right? You can say to paint this room, I will need 100 rupees. So 100 rupees is a monetary value. In the same way, when I'm giving you money, there's a monetary value. So the value exchanged is economical, right? You can define it on a money basis. However, under justa causa, it says it doesn't have to be economical, right? It doesn't have to be defined by money. It can be something like love, right? I will give you this, you will show me more love. I will give you this, and our business partnership will grow. So it can be something like one company saying, I will give you my shares if you promise me that we will have a stronger business relationship. So a stronger business relationship under English law will not have a monetary value, right? You can't measure how valuable stronger business relationship is with money. But still, under justa causa, it says that is fine. It doesn't have to be monetarily defined. I hope that difference makes sense. If it does not, please put to the chat, right? Next, capacity. So capacity means you should be able to enter into a contract in the first place. General rule of thumb, people who are minors do not have a capacity. People who are intoxicated, meaning drunk or on drugs, do not have capacity, right? People who are insane or of unsound mind do not have capacity. So we'll talk about that as well. And finally, legality, right? So legality will be dealt with a bit more when it comes to vitiating factors. So it's mostly these things that I will be dealing with, which is offer, acceptance, intention, capacity. If I have time, I will do consideration, right? Okay, hopefully this makes sense. If I do a quick summary, a contract is a legally enforceable agreement. For an agreement to become a contract, there are several things that are required. You require intention, consideration or justa causa, capacity, and legality. Okay, so we're moving on to the next topic, which is offer. Now, we might have done this a bit when it was the assignment time because we had to deal with was it an offer or an intention to treat. So this won't be too complicating for you guys. Okay. So first off, let's define what an offer is. An offer is a clear expression of willingness to enter into a contract on specified terms made with the intention that it will become binding as soon as accepted. Now, sounds like a long definition, but all of these things are required. First, clear expression. Why does this matter? Because if it is an unclear expression, if it is not definite, if it is not specific, we can't call it an offer. Let's take, for instance, this idea, right? A person says, I might sell my car for 100,000. I might sell it, right? That is not clear enough, right? He's been very vague, right? He's not expressing whether he would actually sell it for 100,000, whether he wants to sell it in the first place. There is no clarity, right? So first, for an offer, it must be clear. Secondly, an offer is talking about specific terms. Now, when it comes to an offer, your terms need to be specific enough. At the point your terms are not specific enough, we say it is not an offer, but it can be an ITT or an invitation to trade. We'll talk about that as well. Next, an offer should have intention. Intention to become binding as it is accepted. So let's take, for instance, this example, right? We have a shop. In the shop, we have a knife. A flick knife is shown on the display. A flick knife. A flick knife is a sort of knife that can be used for like offensive purposes, right? You can kill someone with a flick knife much more easier than you can with a small normal cutting knife, right? So you have displayed a flick knife on your window shop. A child comes to you and says, "Give me the flick knife." And you say, "No, I don't want to sell a flick knife to a child." So here there's a question of, was the flick knife on the window an offer? No, it was not. Why? If it was an offer, the second the child said, "I want to buy it," there should be a contract, right? Because for it to be an offer, the second that someone accepts it, there will be a contract. But in this instance, the shopkeeper could still say, "No, I don't want to sell it to you." What does that mean? The flick knife on the window was not an offer. It was something else. We'll talk about it later, which is an ITT, right? So for it to be an offer, it is a must that it will become binding as soon as it's accepted. The second that someone says, "I want to buy it," there's a contract, right? Okay, so requirements for a valid offer. Please remember these three requirements. Even if you can't remember the definition, these three requirements will help you out. First, there must be an intention to be bound as soon as it's accepted. Secondly, there must be definite terms. And finally, there must be a communication. Now, communication does not have to be verbal or written. It can be expressed as well. For instance, if I can't speak, but I still give you, a piece of, I give you something and I'm like, "You can buy it," even though I can't say it out loud. I sort of hint at you that you can buy it and I'm going to take it for 100 rupees. That's still a communication, right? Communication doesn't have to be verbal. It can be written down as well. And it, in some instances, can be implied. So what communication means is the offerer, the person who's offering it, must communicate it to the offeree. Offeree is the person who's accepting it. So for there to be a valid offer, there are three requirements. If I go through them again. Firstly, there must be an intention. I intend to be bound the second that it is accepted. Secondly, it must be definite. It must be specific. The terms must be clear. And finally, there must be a communication. I must tell them that I'm willing to sell it to you, right? Okay. So let me go through with another example here. Oh, no, actually, let's move on. So here, there's an explanation or like an example that I've given here. Ravi texts his friend, "Thinking of selling my land in Kandy for around 10 million. So thinking, he's not expressing a clear will to be bound. There is no clear intention to be bound, right? Also for around 10 million. It's not definite, right? It's not certain. So then there is no offer here. So I hope that makes sense. Right. So let's look at types of offers that there are. We have bilateral offers and unilateral offers. Bilateral offers, we say it is a promise for a promise. And this is the most common type of offers. So let's take an example here. We have a carpenter and we have a person who has a house, right? So this is carpenter and this is the person who wants his service. If I meant, one second, there's a question. If I verbally say I'll buy it, isn't it a contract? Yes, I'm saying communication can happen either written or verbal. It does not have to be only written, right? It can be verbal, it can be written, but it can also be implied. For instance, if you tell me that I want your service, but you don't tell me exactly that, it's, oh, you know what, we'll go through that later. But if I was not clear, communication can be written, but it can also be verbal, but it can also be through conduct sometimes, right? Okay, all right. So we have a carpenter and we have someone who wants his service. So we have A and we have B, right? So A says, I will fix your door for 100 rupees. And then the person who wants the service says, sure, I will pay you 100 rupees if you fix my door. What we have here is the carpenter making a promise and the service person making a promise. The carpenter says, I will fix your door. The person who wants the service say, I will pay you 100. So it's fix my door for 100 rupees. That is what we call a bilateral offer. One person makes a promise, the other person also makes a promise. So in this instance, there is communication between the two parties and acceptance is communicated. The carpenter says, I will fix the door for 100. The service person says, I accept. I will pay you 100. So their acceptance, the notice of acceptance was given to the carpenter. Now, on the other hand, we have unilateral offers. In unilateral offers, it's not a promise for a promise, but rather a promise for an act. So what does this mean? You're not making a promise, but rather you're doing an action. Let's take, for instance, person A who lost his dog. Lost his dog. So he puts out an advertisement in a newspaper and he's like, I have lost my dog. I will pay 1,000 rupees to anyone who finds my dog. Then we have person B who read the advertisement, randomly found the dog and returned the dog to A. Now, in this instance, you might have realized there is no promise to a promise, right? Because nowhere did B promise A that, oh, you will give me 1,000 rupees? Sure, I will find your dog for you. There is no promise, right? There is simply action on the side of B. B simply found the dog, so which is an action. So when a promise is met with an action, we say that it is a unilateral contract. I hope that makes sense. In a bilateral contract, a promise is made with is met with a promise. In a unilateral contract, a promise is met with an act. So in a unilateral contract, you don't need to give communication of acceptance because B does not have to look at the newspaper, call A and say, yes, I will go finding for the dog. You will surely pay me 1,000, right? You don't have to accept it, right? You don't have to tell A that I accept it. It's fine as long as you perform, as long as you act. So in unilateral contracts, the acceptance is through performance, right? So remember that acceptance, I don't know why my phone is not writing today. Acceptance is through performance. Performance. In a bilateral contract, acceptance is through a promise. So let's take this example, this very, very famous example for contract law, which is Carlyle versus Carbolic Smoke Board. Now, in this case, I'm only going to be dealing with the bilateral contract aspect of it, but there is an intention part in this as well. Now, we have a company and we have a person, right? So we have the company, which is the smoke ball company, and we have the person who is Mrs. Carlyle. Now, the smoke ball company wanted to advertise their smoke ball. A smoke ball is a kind of It's a kind of thing that you can use when you have a flu, right? You put the smoke ball like close to your nose or whatever, and then you inhale it and then you get better or something. So they have a smoke ball, they want to advertise it. So they put out an advertisement and they say, if you use our smoke ball according to the instructions that are given in it, and you still catch influenza, we will pay you £100. We are so confident that once you use our smoke ball, you will not catch any influenza, you will not catch any flu. We are so confident that we are even going to pay you if you get influenza. So Mrs. Carlyle reads this advertisement. She goes to the smoke ball shop, whatever, gets a smoke ball and uses it. And still, even after using it, she catches influenza. So she catches influenza. Then she's like, okay, you guys promised that you will pay me £100. If I catch influenza, you have to pay me £100. Then the smoke ball company says, no, no, hold on. We don't know if you accepted this or not, right? This was just an invitation to treat. We can't make a contract not knowing who accepts it and all of that. In this case, the court says, no, the smoke ball company made a unilateral contract, right? They made a contract to the rest of the world. So anybody could accept it. Nobody had to give them a notice of acceptance, right? Mrs. Carlyle didn't have to call them and say, look, I'm going to buy your smoke ball. If I get sick, you have to pay me back. She does not have to accept it. She just has to perform. She just has to use the smoke ball and still get influenza. So in this case, the court established what a unilateral offer is like. When it comes to a unilateral offer, anybody can accept it as long as they perform, right? As long as they act, and they don't have to give notice of acceptance. So that's what this case is about. And the court said, no, it's not an invitation to treat, it is an offer. So let's deal with that. What is the difference between an offer and an invitation to treat, which is our next topic? Now, the definition for an invitation to treat is very simply, there are better definitions, but this is the simplest definition that I can give you. A preliminary step inviting others to make an offer. It shows willingness to negotiate, but it is not an offer. Let me give you an example for this. Now, let's say that we have someone who puts out, like who has a little shop and he has alcohol bottles on stand, right? So there are lots of alcohol bottles. And if this was an offer, let's say this display was an offer. I'm going with the same example as the flick knife before. If this was an offer, anyone who comes to the stand, looks at the prices of the alcohol bottle as 1,000 rupees, will say, give me the bottle, and the person should give them that bottle. Why? Because it was an offer. But it is not. We say this is just an invitation to treat. The person who puts this on display is asking other people, the customers, to make an offer. It is the customer who goes to the shop, gets the bottle from the shelf, shows it to this person and says, can I buy it? So it's not the person making the offer, it's the customer making the offer. So person A who's selling it, he's simply doing an ITT. He's simply making an invitation to trade. Person B who wants to buy it goes to A, gives in the bottle and says, I will like to buy this for 1,000 rupees. It's the customer who makes the offer, not the person selling it. So what are we talking about here? It is asking to negotiate, right? The person who's selling it can choose not to give it to this person, maybe because the person is a minor, maybe because he feels like this person won't be able to pay him or something like that. It's still up to the seller to decide. So if you get a case and you are like, is this an ITT or is this an offer? One thing to look at is the person willing to be bound upon acceptance? That's the question that you have to ask, right? If someone accepts it, is the person immediately bound? Let's take the same case that we had for our assignment, right? We have a social media influencer. Let's say her name is A. We have a social media influencer. And then we have B, who is the artist. right? This was the assignment question. Now, in this instance, we have to decide when the social media influencer puts out a post saying, I will give a promotion and money to the person who makes the best logo. Is that an offer? Is that an IT? Simplest question to ask in this instance, is the person willing to be bound upon acceptance? So the second that any artist puts a drawing out, does that mean the social media influencer is bound by it, right? Say any artist puts it, right? Some artist puts an absolutely ugly picture out there, and the social media influencer is like, I don't like this. But if the influencer had no choice but to accept it, it was an offer, right? Say we have two artists. Artist B puts a really nice photo, artist C puts a really ugly photo. But the social media influencer only says, the first person who sends me a photo, I will give him money. That's all he says. She doesn't say the prettiest one, the one that is to my liking. She doesn't say anything like that. The first person who DMs me a good photo, I will give him the money. So let's say both of these parties put the photo. B and C, both of them put it. But C put the really ugly one and he was the first one to put it. B put a really pretty one, but he was the second one to put it. In this instance, A would obviously prefer to have B. But this was an offer. Why? Because he does not have a choice to select B. Because in his comment, he said, not the prettiest one, but the first one who sends it. So the question you should ask is are they bound the second that someone accepts it? I hope I'm clear here. If I'm not clear, just let me know, right? If the person was not bound immediately, if this additional thing was there, the prettiest one I will give it to, then he has discretion, right? A can choose whether to give it to B to whether to give it to B or give it to C, because it's up to A to choose who to give it to. But if A cannot choose whether to give it to B or to C, and as immediately as C puts the photo, he's bound, that is an offer. I hope that makes sense. I feel like I repeated it a lot of times, so it might not make sense. Can I know whether it was confusing?
ඉසුරු
Yes.
ඒක චුට්ටක් ආයෙ පොඩ්ඩක් පැහැදිලි කරන්න
Oh,
පුළුවන්ද?
yes, yes, sure. Let me, Ane, please, people don't move the whiteboard. It's a bit hard when you move it. Thank you. Right, so let me explain that again. Thank you so much, Sachin. Use a different example. Yeah, that's better. Shall I just continue and then do it? You know what? Let's use an example of a tender, right? Okay, so let's say there is a company A, who is opening up their entire thing for tenders. They want tenders for iron, right? And when they're putting out the bid, they say, we will give it to the highest bidder. They say, we will give it to the highest bidder. Then we have company B, who says, we will accept this tender for 100,000 rupees. And we have company C, who says, we will accept this bid for 200,000 rupees. So clearly, the bid should go to C. Bid will go to C. Why? Because there was a clear offer. It was definite, right? Offer was definite, and A does not get to choose. So let's say on another version of it, company A puts out a tender. But in this instance, they don't say we are going to give it to the highest bidder. They say we will give it to the person we prefer, the company that we think is most reliable company. That can be decided either with money, that can be decided either with their status, that can be decided with things like, is that company going bankrupt or not, right? That's up to A to decide. So A leaves the power to decide up to them. Then B gives 100,000 as before, and C gives 200,000. In this instance, A thinks, look, even though C gave more, I think B is more reliable, right? C has gone through some bankruptcies. Company C is a bit suspicious, right? There seems to be a lot of corruption that's happening in company C. You know what? We will give it to B. What do we see in this instance? So bid will go to B because A can trust B more. Now, this is like a very simple example of a difference between an offer and an ITT. When it is an offer, A has no choice. A has no choice, and the terms are so definite that they cannot pick who they want. So, when it comes to the first instance, this is not a willingness to negotiate, right? There is no negotiation, right? Whoever puts the highest bid will get it. However, in the second option, you can clearly see there is room for negotiation, right? Room for negotiation. It is B and C who's making an offer. It's not A, right? A is simply asking B and C to make their best offer, and A gets to choose. When the person gets to choose and there's room for negotiation and the terms are not definite enough, we say it is an invitation to treat because it is not clear enough, it's not definite enough, and A is not bound to accept, right? In this instance, A is not bound to accept C simply because they gave more, right? A gets to choose. So at the point the person making the offer sort of has more room to choose, we say it is an invitation to treat. However, if the person who's offering does not get any choice at all, they have to accept whoever accepted it, we say that it is an offer. I hope the differentiation makes sense. Hopefully when we are doing the cases, it will make a bit more sense. Sachin, thanks, Shepta.
Oh, is it?
Okay, hopefully, again, if anything messes up, let me know. Right, so let's go with this example. Okay, when it comes to certain things, we say those are invitations to trade. They are not offers. There's a presumption that these things are invitations to trade. So we'll talk a few things under that, right? Advertisements, auctions, tenders, and stuff like that, we say generally there's a presumption that it's going to be an invitation to treat and not an offer. But again, there are exceptions. So let's go through with them. First, we have an advertisement, Partridge versus Crittenden. In this case, I'm again going to use this simple space over here. We have one party, we have a person advertising, let's say person A, who's advertising in a magazine saying that he's going to sell Bramblefinch hens and Bramblefinch cocks. Now, these hens and cocks are actually wild animals. You cannot sell them, and there is a statute which is the the Protection of Birds Act, which says you can't sell wild animals. So in this instance, you can't offer to sell wild animals. So they sue whoever this party is, sues the person who put the ad saying this ad is an offer to sell wild animals and he should be punished for that. He should be given a fine or something for that. In this instance, the court says an advertisement is not an offer, but an invitation to treat. Why do they say that? Why does an advertisement become an ITT and not an offer? So in purple here, we have the rationale for it. The first reason why an advertisement does not become an offer, but rather becomes an ITT is because of something called unlimited liability. Now, if let's say an ad was an offer, right? Let's say this party, the party who put, I left because I'm, okay, that's fine. Let's say when this person put this advertisement out saying that I will sell these cocks and hens, it was an offer. Let's assume that it was an offer. In this instance, say B, C, D, and E, all of them accepted. They all accepted. He asks for 5, he asks for 10 hens, he asks for 50, and he asks for 20. But A only has 5. He only has 5 cocks and hens, but these people all say, I want 5, I want 10, I want 15, and I want 20. If he was making an offer, he will have to accept these, right? Because, like we said, when it is an offer, the second that someone accepts it, you are legally bound to them. So, if B, C, D, and E all say, I want this much, now B and A, C and A, D and A, and E and A are all legally bound, right? A will have to give the bramble finches, cocks and hens to these people. So it's unrealistic, right? It's unrealistic to expect an advertiser to be legally bound to anyone who accepts an advertisement. That is why we say an advertisement is an ITT and not an offer, because it's stupid to expect so many people to accept something when you most definitely don't have that much stocks, right? You can't be legally bound to everyone who accepts your advertisement. So we say an advertisement is an ITT and not an offer. Then, second thing is, this is not that important, but this one, to preserve the seller's freedom to choose. Let's go back to that example of, oh no, we can't use that. So let's take this example, right? A person puts an advertisement saying that I am going to sell some very, very fancy gun to anyone who wants to buy it. I'm going to sell it for 1,500. I know it's not a big much, but let's say he wants to sell this fancy gun for 1,500. And this was an offer. Assume that this was an offer. A child accepts it. What happens there? The person will have to sell the gun to the child. That's not realistic, right? We should still let the person have a say in who he sells it to. So, because we want to preserve the seller's freedom of choice, we say an advertisement is not an IT offer, but it is an ITT. Because when it's an ITT, you can just say, no, I'm not going to sell it to a child, right? And you can say, bring me a better negotiation. Next, commercial practicality. So this is because when you put out an advertisement, you are not trying to be legally bound to everybody who sees that advertisement, right? You are just trying to attract customers. There's a case called PepsiCo. I don't remember the whole name of the case. So in PepsiCo case, what happens is there is an ad where basically they say that there will be Pepsi points, right? Like you can buy Pepsi cans and behind in the can, you will find like 1 point. So every single can is 1 point. If you collect around 20 cans, you can get a shirt or something. If you get around 50 cans, you can get something a bit bigger. So, just a normal advertisement. And in the ad, at a certain point, they say, if you collect 100,000 points, you can get a Harrier jet. A Harrier jet is like a military jet. Now, they were just puffing, right? This is what we call puffery. Puffery is not an offer, right? This is why advertisements do not count as offers. Puffery is when you are exaggerating, right? Oh, if you buy 100,000 Pepsi cans, we will get you a military jet. That is a lie, right? They're just exaggerating. But if we consider advertisements as offers, then PepsiCo is legally liable to anyone who gets 100,000 points. And this actually happened. Some guy was like, no, that was an offer. The advertisement was not an ITT. He collected 100,000 Pepsi cans, 100,000 or something like that, sent it to Pepsi and said, give me my Harrier jet back. And in that case, the court said, look, it's not an offer. It's an IT. Oh my God. It's an ITT, right? Okay. So the reasons why an advertisement does not become an offer, but rather become an ITT, because you are expected to write rationales when it comes to answers, right? You can't just say, oh, in Partridge versus Crittenden, they decided that an ITT, an advertisement is an ITT, not an offer, and then just get away with it. You sort of do have to mention why they decided it, right? So when we're talking about why an ad is an ITT, there are 3 things we can talk about to ensure that the seller has the freedom of choice, to make sure that you protect advertisers from unlimited liability, from being liable to so many people when you have limited stocks, and finally to protect advertisers because usually advertisements are puffery. Okay, we've spent a lot of time on that. Let's move on to goods on display. Okay, there's actually exceptions here, which I forgot to talk about. Now, even though generally we say advertisements are ITTs, you might have realized from Carlyle versus Carbolic Smokeball, advertisements can become offers in some instances. What are the instances an advertisement converts into an offer? For an advertisement to become an offer, there must be several things. Firstly, there must be an intention to be legally bound because you know in an ITT that intention does not exist. So in Carlyle versus Carbolic Smokeball, what happened, if you remember, the company said, we will give you 100 pounds. We are so sure about this that we have deposited 1,000 pounds already into a bank account. So this clearly show an intention. In the same way, if PepsiCo, in that example that we used before, said something like, we have a Harrier jet, which is reserved for anyone who can get 100,000 points, that would have shown intention, right? If you showed intention and if the terms were specific enough, if terms were specific enough, oh, please don't move it, please. Whoever is moving it, just please put it down. Okay. Can you not move the whiteboard? Thank you so much. What was I saying? Right. So, okay. Become an offer. There are two things that should be met. Firstly, the intention to be legally bound must be clear. Secondly, the terms should be definite. I don't know what you're trying to achieve by moving the whiteboard. Excuse me, sir. Okay. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Moving on, goods on display. So we talked about advertisements. Moving on to goods on display. Now, we talked about this before with that example of the flick knife. The case is Fisher versus Bell. In this case, what basically happens is a person displays a flick knife on the window. Then he is charged for the offense against persons act because you are not supposed to offer sale of these offensive weapons. And the court was like, he didn't offer a sale. It was just an invitation to treat. If a child came and asked the shopkeeper, he obviously wouldn't sell it. If an insane person came and asked the shopkeeper, he wouldn't sell it, right? Because it was not an offer. It's just an invitation to treat. So we can't sue this person under the Offense Against Persons Act. So that is Fisher versus Bell. The other case is Pharmaceutical Society versus Boot Cash Chemist. What happens in this case is we have a what do you call that? A pharmacy, right? We have a pharmacy, and this is a self-serve pharmacy, right? So basically, what a self-serve pharmacy is you have all the medicine on a shelf, right? And the customer can look at these medicine and he can pick those medicine and put them into his basket. Then he will go to the cashier, and then in the cashier we do have a pharmacist. So it is the customer who's picking the medicine, but it's the pharmacist who decides whether this medicine could be prescribed or not. Now, in this case, what the what's it's called Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain basically says, no, the things that are on the shelf, the medicine on the shelf are offers. So when the customer takes that medicine and puts it in his basket, he has accepted it. So when he has taken the medicine and put it into his basket, a contract has been formed, which means a sale has been made. So basically, they're saying when the customer puts a medicine into their basket, there was a sale that was made. And under a certain statute that they had, when you sell medicine without a prescription, that is considered to be an offense, right? So here, when you put the medicine into your basket, the plaintiff said that it was a sale and thereby it was an offense. But here the court says no, right? Just because the customer selected the medicine, that doesn't mean it's a sale, right? Because they are not accepting because the customer cannot accept because what was on the shelf was not an offer, but rather an ITT. When the customer puts the medicine on their baskets, it's not a sale because it is simply them like choosing that medicine. When they go to the cashier and give the medicine to the pharmacist there, the customer is making the offer, the pharmacist is accepting it. So it is only at the counter that a contract is being formed or a sale is being made. And when there's a pharmacist who's there while the sale is being made, it's not an offense, right? Because according to the statute, what an offense is a sale without a pharmacist, right? If you are selling medicine without the prescription of a pharmacist. But here, the pharmacist is at the cashier who's making the sale, right? So they're like, no, the displays are an ITT, they're not an offer, so it is not an offense. Hopefully that makes sense. If it did not, please put to the chat and say that did not make sense. I'm completely fine with repeating. Did anyone say anything? No. Okay, moving on. Request for information. Auctions. There is another case here which I have not mentioned, which is Havela Investments, but I'll talk about that as well. So auctions and tenders. Now, what is an auction? An auction is when there's a person and he's willing to sell something to anyone who's willing to buy it at the highest price. So auctions can be in two ways, right? So auctions can be in two ways. There are auctions with reserve, and there are auctions without reserve. Now, when it is a with reserve auction, what that means is there is a minimum price. Now, let's take, for instance, a painting, the painting of Mona Lisa, right? And there is an auction to sell it to some museums. So here, let's say this was a with reserve auction. When it comes to a with reserve auction, that means there is a minimum price that is set. So there are like the minimum price is 10,000, starting from 10,000 without reserve auction. What that means is this minimum price is not given. Whoever gives the highest price, you will get it, right? Now, the case that we have here is a without reserve auction. It's Heathcote Ball versus Barry. Here, we have two machines, right? Each of those machines was 14,000 pounds worth. And then the person says, okay, I reserve. That's a risk that you are taking. Because when it's without parties who came in, and this auction, unfortunately, would have said the minimum price is 14,000, but this was so the highest bidder in this auction turned out to be 200 pounds, which was a very low bid, right? And here the person was like, you know what, I'm not going to sell it. It's very unfair that I have to sell my machines, which are worth 14,000 to $200, right? But then the court said no. Then it is a without reserve auction. It is not an ITT, but rather a unilateral offer. Why? Because when it's without reserve, you are saying, I will give to whoever the highest bidder is. You are not saying, I will get to choose it. If you said, I get to choose who the highest bidder is, no, if I get to choose who I'm going to sell it to, then it's an ITT. But here you are saying, I will give it to the highest bidder. Then it's an offer, not an ITT. So remember, if there's ever a question where there's an auction which is without reserve, remember it's an offer, not an ITT, because there's no minimum price. Okay. Then we have tenders. Auctions and tenders are quite similar, right? Auctions are when you want to sell an item, tenders are when you want to buy an item. So tenders usually go for the lowest bid, but can also go for the highest bid as well. Let's look at this example, which is Spencer versus Harding. Now, in this case, they don't say this is a this is a with reserve. Oh, no, wait. Okay. They don't say they're going to sell to the highest bidder. This is the same example that I used before, right? We have two parties. We have spending. Harding puts out a circular. A circular is basically a document which says we will accept these kinds of bids. In the document, there is no mention of like who they are going to select. They simply say, make us your offers. So they are asking parties to make offers. So this was just an ITT. So one party gives the highest bid. Let's say that they gave 200,000. Everybody else gave lower than them. And then Harding said, no, even though you gave the highest bid, we are not going to give this to you. We are going to give it to someone else. Then the plaintiffs were like, no, we gave you the highest bid. You should give us the tender because we literally gave you the highest bid. In this case, the court said, it is not an offer. Why? Because nowhere in that document was it said that they will sell it to the highest bidder. But you see, still keeps discretion or still keeps power to themselves to make the decision on who they choose, it is not an offer, right? Because if you get to decide who you want to choose, that is an ITT. In this instance, they didn't say that we are going to give it to the highest bidder, so the tender goes to whoever they want it to go to. There's another case, which is Havela Investments versus, what do you call that? Royal something. Let me share a question with that. So I would like to do this with a question. I know it's going to take more time, but I feel like it's kind of good to do it with a question. So let me share screen. Give me a second. Right. So this is a question that we have. It is a question which includes everything, including the like intention and stuff like that as well, acceptance and stuff as well. But let's just look at this as it is, right? So the University of Bologna is interested in repurposing one of its old halls to a state-of-the-art auditorium. The project chairperson, Martin, put up a notice on the university's Facebook page calling for closed tenders. So let's try to first understand what a closed tender is. Now, when it is a closed tender, the other person does not know how much you are bidding for. So let's say we have company A, we have B, C, and D, and A is calling for tenders. Usually, when it is an open tender, B says 100,000, C hears that it's 100,000, so he says it's 200,000. D is like, no, I want this tender, so he says 300,000. All of these parties are aware of what the other party says. This is an open tender. When it is a closed tender, none of them know, right? B sends it not anonymously, like B sends it to A, but C does not know that B sent 10,000. Then C sends something, but D does not know what C sent. That's like nobody knows what the other person is sending. They have to send the best bid, hoping that they are the highest bidder. That's what a closed tender is, right? A closed tender sort of forces the other parties to decide the best price. And it's quite easier compared. I don't want to go into why closed tenders are rational. Let's just say that this was a closed tender, right? Closed tender meaning nobody knew what the other party's price was. So they individually had to decide what the highest price was. So I'm like, okay, the other company would not go as high as 100,000. They will probably stop at 50,000. So let's put 100,000, something like that, right? Okay. So they put closed tenders for the least expensive building contract. It was specified that the bid can be sent through a social media platform on WhatsApp. Martin received many bids. One of the bids received was from the company WeBuild, which stated that it was willing to enter into a contract for 15 million rupees or for 100,000 rupees more than the lowest bid, lower than the best tender. So what does that mean? This is literally the same case as Havela Investments. I'm going to explain it in my answer, but if you want the case name, it's this, which is Havela Investments versus Royal Trust of Canada, right? So this is literally the same case, but let me explain what's happening here. The university says, send us your lowest bid. Lowest bid. Then we have two parties. We have WeBuild, which is party B, WeBuild, who says we are willing to give this for 15 million rupees 15 million rupees, or we will be giving it for 100,000 less than the lowest one. So let's say party A gave 14 million as their bid. Actually, they should be the one who gets the tender. Why? Because they gave the lowest bid. However, because this exception is there, since the lowest bid is 14 million, what B would give is 13,900. I hope that makes sense because they say 100,000 less than the lowest bid. So whatever anyone else sends, they will still get the bid. Why? Because they are willing to go 100,000 less than whoever sends the lowest one. This is what we call a referential bid. You are referring to someone else's lowest bid and saying, I will do less than that. Or you are referring to someone else's highest bid and you're saying, I will do higher than that. That is not reasonable for a closed bid. This is completely fine. If it was an open bid where you are like 100,000 more than the highest one, it's open. Everybody knows what the prices is. But in this case, A will have no choice, right? A will always lose regardless of how low they go because B has this condition. In Havela Investments case, they said referential bids for closed bids are not allowed. It is not a valid offer. And that's what we have here. So B's bid would be 15 million. And the second condition where they say 100,000 less than that is not valid. So we will consider 14 million for A, 15 million for B. The person who should get it is A. That's what was established in Havela Investments. They said referential bids are not allowed. So let's look at the answer here. The first question is about invitation to treat versus an offer. So I'm just going to quick read through this answer. If there's anything that anyone has to add to it, please do say. Okay. The legal nature of the notice, okay, this part is not important. Here, an offer is a clear statement of terms which a person is prepared to be legally bound. The second that someone says yes to it, a contract is immediately formed. On the other hand, what is an ITT? It is merely an invitation for others to make an offer. It is not the end of a contract, but the start of negotiations. Now, generally, remember the case that we said before, which is Spencer versus Harding. In this case, they did not talk about the highest bidder. They simply put out a tender and said, we will select whoever we wish. In this case, it is an ITT and not an offer. ITT, not an offer, right? So in that case, the court decided it was like they were not bound, the person who put out the tender were not bound to accept the person who sent the highest bid. They could accept whoever they want. But in this case, Havila Investments versus Royal Trust, they expressly said, we will accept the highest bidder. When you say, I will accept the highest bidder, you don't have a choice anymore. So that means it's an offer. In this case, we can say whoever sends what University of Cologne sent out was an offer. It was not an ITT. So that is established. We established that it's not an ITT, it is an offer. Now we have to look at, was this a valid offer that VBuild sent out? According to the Havela Investments case, it is not a valid offer because you can't make referential bids for closed bids. So if you were addressing this question, there are two things that you have to answer here. First, you look at, was there an intention by the University of Cologne to be bound by anyone who sent the lowest bid? Yes, there was an intention and thereby there is an offer. Secondly, is there any discretion that University of Cologne leaves for themselves to choose the tenderer that they want? No, they do not have such discretion because they said, we will pick the one who sent the lowest bids. That means it is an offer and not an ITT. Then we look into, is the offer made by Havela Investment a valid offer? It is not. Why? It was a referential bid. And under this case, Havela Investments, referential bids are not valid offers. So that means the person who should get this is going to be the other party, which is Builders Ltd. I hope that made sense. I will talk about the rest of the question later when we have finished intention and the others, but I hope that made sense. Any questions with that answer? If you do, please do put in the chat. Okay, moving on. Right. Then we have request of information and declaration of intention. Do these become an offer or not? Now, now in this case, it's Harris versus Nickerson. It is another case that you can use for advertisements, by the way. In Harris versus Nickerson, we have an auctioneer who advertises in a magazine saying, "I will sell furniture on sale." Right? He says, "I will have this whole sale. It's going to be in this place at this time, and I will be selling furniture." But then we have this other party. So that we have the auctioneer on one end. Then we have this party who was so interested in buying the furniture that he traveled really far to get to this place. And he was like, "You made me an offer. I came, sell me the furniture." But the auctioneer, in the last moment, decided not to sell some of those furniture. He decided to withdraw some of the furniture. And then the person who was traveling from afar said, "You can't do that. You promised that you will sell it. You can't withdraw it after making an offer." But the court said, no, an advertisement was simply an ITT and it was not an offer. When he put out to an advertisement saying that "I am willing to sell these," he wasn't willing to be bound to anyone who came so far, traveled all the way to his place to buy it, right? So in this case, it's another example for advertisements and a declaration of intention, because he said, "I am willing to sell it," but he didn't say, "I will sell it to anyone who comes to my house," right? So there again, we have an ITT, not a offer. Again, request of information, it is not an offer. In this case, we have two parties. We have Harvey and Facey. The conversation is about a piece of land called Bumper Hall Pen. We have Harvey sending a telegram to Facey saying, "Will you sell Bumper Hall Pen?" and asks, "What is your lowest price for it?" And Facey replies, Facey doesn't reply to the first part of the question. He replies, "The lowest price is £900. And then Harvey says, "I will buy it for £900. So we see a conversation happening here, right? We have Harvey and we have Facey. Harvey asks, "Will you sell it to us?" Facey does not reply. He says, "The lowest price is 900." Here, the court said it was an ITT, right? He was not saying, "I will sell it to you for £900. He was saying the lowest price is £900. He was opening up for negotiations. He was opening up for Harvey to say, "Okay, how about £1,000? How about £1,200?" He was opening it out for negotiations. He wasn't saying, "Oh, I will sell it to you for the lowest price." So when you are replying or giving an answer to a question, that is not an offer being made, right? For an offer to be made, you must clearly communicate that you want to be bound. And the other thing is simply giving an answer to a question or giving an answer like "the lowest price is this" is an ITT and not an offer. Okay, so we have done this part. Let me go through them again because there was quite a lot. We talked about invitation generally be considered as TTs and not offers. For that, we talked about two cases. We talked about Partridge versus Crittenden, and we talked about Harris versus Nickerson. In both of these cases, advertisements were considered ITTs and not offers. Then, advertisements can become offers. The example that we gave for that is Carlisle versus Carbolic Smoke Ball. When an advertisement can become an offer, there must be a clear intention to be bound and the terms must be definite. Then, goods on display. Goods on display are typically ITTs, not offers. Two cases under it. Fisher versus Bell, the case with the flick knife. Pharmaceutical Society versus Food Cash Chemist, the case to do with the medicine and the self-serve store. Then we have auctions that we talked about two types of auctions, with reserve and without reserve. When it is a without reserve auction, that is where you don't have a minimum price, you have to give it to the highest bidder regardless of how low the price is. The case for that is Heathcote Ball versus Barry. On the same note as auctions, we talked about tenders. Under tenders, we said if the tender doesn't specify that it's going to give it to the highest bidder, then it is an ITT. But if the tender says we will give it to the highest bidder or we will give it to the lowest bidder, that is an offer, right? If it is definite. So we also did, what was the case? Havila Investments versus Royal Trust. Under that, we identified that referential bids are not allowed. Okay, referential bids are when you refer to another bid and say, I'm going to do 100,000 more than that, or 100,000 less than that, or something like that. Then, request of information is not an offer. Harvey versus Pacey. For it to be an offer, there must be a definite intention to be bound. Declaration of intention is not an offer. Sorry, declaration of intention, that's a very bad word here. Let me cut that. Rather, we will just say advertisements here. Advertisements, because declaration of investment, that's a weird thing. Okay, so advertisements, not an offer. Offer again. Right, termination of offer. This is taking way longer than I wanted it to. So an offer is not like, you are not like always legally bound to it. Sometimes, in some cases, your offer can not be like, can be terminated, right? So even if the other party accepted it, it's like, oh, it's too late. So one of the reasons that your offer can be terminated is if your offer was revoked. Revoked means the person who's offering it says, no, I can't offer it anymore. Too bad, I'm going to take it back. So the case that we have for that is, oh, what the hell? Bryan and Co. versus Leon Van. In this case, this is a case which is about like revocation not working out. So we have two parties, right? We have Van on one side and we have Bryan on the other side. So Van posts an offer, So Van posts an offer to Bryan earlier, right? And then Bryan accepts it. So he makes an offer, he posts it, and he accepts it. However, before this date of acceptance, he accepted it on the 11th by post, Van decided to revoke the offer on the 8th. So let's say I am sending an offer and then I'm like, you know what, I don't want it. And I send a revocation of the offer. So I say, I will sell you this. But then a few days later, I'm like, no, I can't sell you this. I'm so sorry. But before my revocation like goes to the offeree had already accepted it, right? So before the letter goes to that person, the offeree had accepted. Now we do have a rule for this, which is the postal rule. Under the postal rule, if you accept, like the second that you accept it and put to the post, it is already accepted. But under revocation, it says revocation of an offer does not have the postal rule. It should go to the offeree. I feel like this is a bit confusing. Was that clear? Oh, I can repeat again. I feel like it might have not been clear. Let me write it. The longer the time goes, the more crazy I sound. Okay, so I'm going to finish at offer. If someone can continue with accept. Abdullah, are you online? Abdullah, if you can, just continue with acceptance. Govinda, if you're there, please do. I feel crazy now. Okay, so this is how it goes, right? In this case, we have we have Van Leeuwen, not big enough. We have Van on one side. He's making an offer. Let's say he made the offer on the 3rd of October. And he made it through post. The offer reaches the other party. It reaches, the other party's name is Bryan, right? So the offer reaches Bryan. Then Bryan decides to accept it. Bryan accepts it and sends a letter. So he sends a letter on the 11th of October. However, before the 11th of October, Van had already posted a revocation of it on the 8th. But the revocation letter has not yet met Brian. So at the point that Brian accepted the offer, the revocation letter came to him. In this case, the court said it doesn't matter. If the party has already accepted it, you can't revoke the offer. Okay, like let's forget the postal rule part a bit. Just the point that you have to remember here is if the party had already accepted it, you can't revoke an offer. Revocation of the offer can only happen before acceptance. Um, in the case Dickinson versus Dodds, or actually, this case is not that important because I've never seen questions from that. But if you want to go through that case, you can go through it. I feel like it'll be a lot of content if I mention that case as well. Okay, rejection or counteroffer. This is very important, right? An offer should be met with unequivocal acceptance for there to be a contract. If the other party makes a counter offer, there is no offer that was made before. So let me give you this with an example, like a normal example. I am telling that I will sell you a bottle. I am person A. I am telling you, I will sell you a bottle, a green bottle for 100 rupees on Wednesday. This is my offer to you. Then the party who wants to buy the bottle says, lovely, I want the bottle. I want it to be green. I want it to be 100, but I don't want it on Wednesday. Can you give it to me on Thursday? What you have here is not acceptance. What you have here is what we call a counter offer. You are changing a term in the contract, in the offer. When you change at least one single term in the offer, that is considered to be a counter offer. Then person A is like, you know what, it's fine. Okay, true. So I'm like, you know what? It's fine. I'm not going to sell you this to you. I will sell it to person C because he can buy it on Wednesday. And then B says, no, 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 it's fine. I accept your offer. I will buy it on Wednesday. But you can't do that. Why? Once you made a counter offer, the original offer is cancelled. It's terminated. So you can't make a counter offer and then say, you know what, it's fine. I'll accept your offer. That's what happened in this case. In this case, Hyde versus Wrench. Wrench says, I will sell you my farm for £1,000. Hyde says, can I get it for 950? That was a counter offer. Wrench says, no, I can't sell it to you. You know what? I'm just going to sell it to someone else. Hyde then says, no, no, I will buy it for 1,000. But you can't do that. Why? Because the original offer was cancelled, right? Once you make a counter offer, just remember the original offer cancels off. I have got a comment, maybe mentioned Dickinson versus Dodds, so I'll just go through it. In the case Dickinson versus Dodds, what happens is one party makes an offer to sell the house. But before the other party accepts it, he hears from a reliable third party that the offerer had sold the house already. So there was a revocation, but the revocation was not communicated from the offerer. It was rather communicated from a reliable third party. Usually, you cannot revoke an offer unless you communicate it to the person who was accepting it, right, to the offeree. In this case, the court held it doesn't have to be the offerer who communicates it. As long as someone reliable communicated it, there can be revocation. So just remember the principle there. Revocation of an offer always requires communication to the offeree. However, even if the offerer doesn't communicate it, as long as someone reliable did, that is considered to be revocation. Okay, moving on, lapse of time. This case, Ramsgate Victoria Hotel versus Montefiore, very simple case. We have a person who says, I will buy shares in June. The company did not allocate the shares until November, which is like 5 months later, right? This person made an offer, right? This person made an offer, but it took so long for the other party to accept it. So in this case, the court said the offer was lapsed because when the time is gone beyond a reasonable time, then the offer is just gone. So let's take, for instance, I give you person A and person B are there. Person A makes an offer saying, I will sell you my past papers for 100 rupees. And then B takes around 3 months to accept it. And then B says, yes, I want the past papers for 100 rupees 3 months later, right? And then that is what we call lapse of time. There is an unreasonable lapse of time in this conversation. So then A can say, you know what, I can't give it to you anymore. B can't sue A and say, no, he has to give the past papers because he made an offer. Now he's legally bound to me because I accepted it. B can't do that. Why? Because there was such an unreasonable time between the offer being made and it being accepted. So we say, if now unreasonable amount of time is not 5 months, right? It depends on the circumstances. For it to be a share transaction, 5 months is unreasonable. But for something else, maybe 5 months makes sense. Something like we want to, maybe there was an offer that was made to build a dam or something like that, and you needed parliamentary approval, you needed this, you needed that, which would take around 5 months. Then we don't say it's an unreasonable amount of time, right? So when you get a question where you feel like there has been a lot of time lapse, just look if it was an unreasonable time lapse. If it was an unreasonable time lapse since the offer was made, then it is going to be considered as the offer being terminated, right? So even if the other party accepted it, too bad, there's no contract, the offer was terminated. Next, we have death. If the offerer dies, then the offer also dies, right? So that's the general rule. If let's say party A and party B have come to are trying to come into a contract, right? Party A sends a letter saying, I will sell you 100 kilograms of rice for this amount. And then party B accepts it, but before the acceptance, A has died. So in that case, the offer dies with the offerer. However, we say the contract still holds if the offerer died and the offeree did not get notice of the death. So in this case, that's what happened. We have a person who says, I need you to give certain goods to my brother on credit. So that's like, give me my brother like food and stuff like that on credit. I will give you the money later, just give it to him on credit. So the creditor, Bradbury, keeps on supplying the goods to the brother. But the older brother or the person who was guaranteeing it had died at that point. But the thing is, the creditor did not know that that person died. So he still kept on supplying goods. And then the brother fails to pay because he was like, wait, I didn't promise to pay you. My brother did, and my brother died, right? So then Bradbury sues like the rest of, the person who made the contract. He sues them and says, you have to pay me, right? In this case, the court said the estate was liable. Estate means the heirs of the person who made the contract. So let's say it's party A who made the contract and say, I will pay you. And we have party B who supplied the goods, right? So here, let's say A died, B can still ask for the money from A's estate. A's estate means A's heirs, right? People like his children, whoever his legal representatives are, and people like that. So here, the principle that was established is if the offeree is unaware of the offerer's death, the offer is not automatically revoked. Somebody must communicate it to the offeree that the offerer has died. If nobody tells the offeree that the offerer has died, then the offerer's estate is liable. That means the offerer's children and wife or whatever are going to be liable for it. Next case, failure of conditions. If the offer had certain conditions and if one condition failed, the offer also fails. The case that we have here is a car sale, right? Here, what we have is there's a car sale, and in the offer, it says, we will make this offer once the finance company signs it, right? We will give you this car, but the finance company sort of has to sign it. Before the finance company signed the letter, however, the car was damaged. And then the finance company was like, no, no, we made an offer. He accepted it. So there's a contract here. Even though the car is broken, the car belongs to him now. We are not liable. But the court said no. There was a condition in that offer which had to be fulfilled for it to be a full offer. So even though there was like sort of an acceptance going on here, since the offer was not complete, there was no contract, right? There was an implied condition within the offer itself that the car would remain. Wait, okay, this the thing that I've written here is wrong. What actually happens here is something to do with like a condition where there's a signature to be signed. I will fix it and send it to the group, right? In that case, what basically happens, ignore what's written here, financing LTD versus Stimson. Like I said before, there was a condition that the company would sign it and give it to him. So since that condition was not fulfilled, the offer was not fulfilled and the offer was revoked. So if like within the offer there's a condition and that condition isn't fulfilled, just imagine the offer is gone. Let's take for instance the same example as before, the bottle and stuff. So here there are several things that I'm saying. I'm going to give you a bottle, I'm going to give it for green, I'm going to give it for 100, and I'm going to give it to you on Wednesday. But then I fail to give it to you on Wednesday. That's a breach of contract. But say before the acceptance, there's some condition that failed. In that instance, there was no offer either. So for it to be a revocation of offer, just remember it should be before acceptance. Like an offer usually terminates before acceptance, because if the offer terminates after acceptance, it's no longer an offer, right? Once an offer is met with acceptance, there's agreement. And if the other conditions are met, that's a contract, right? So an offer can only be terminated before acceptance. And these are the 5 ways that it can be terminated. Either the party who made the offer revokes it, either the other party, that's the offeree, gives a counter offer and the original offer gets cancelled. Either there's a lapse of time, the party who's supposed to accept it took so much time which was unreasonable, then the offer gets cancelled. Either the offerer died, then the offer gets cancelled, and finally a condition fails, and then again the offer gets cancelled. Okay, I'm quite tired. I want to do acceptance. Is there anyone online who can do acceptance? Govindu?
You want me to continue from where I should?
Acceptance if you can. I will.
Oh, yeah.
Is that fine?
Yeah, sure. Or I can move into consideration since we've done most of acceptance.
Okay, that's cool. Yeah,
Is that fine? Yeah.
that's fine.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll cover consideration. Give me a second. I'll share my screen. Right. My screen is visible, right?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, right. Okay. So I think Isuru covered like the basics of contract, basically offer and acceptance. So another important part of a contract and what makes an agreement a contract, a legally binding contract, is something that we call consideration, right? So when it comes to consideration, consideration is of 2 types. Not 2 types, I would say it differs based on the law that is applicable, right? So in Sri Lanka, we have English law and Roman Dutch law, right? So because of this difference, the application of consideration or this element of consideration differs in our jurisdiction, right? So if there is anything that's unclear, you all can unmute or like just drop me a message, right, through the chat. So when it comes to consideration, this is the English law concept, right? You all might have seen like on deeds and stuff, OPPU or those kind of documents, you tend to have this line saying consideration or valuable consideration, right? Or that's basically the value of that particular deed or the instrument, right? That's basically your consideration, right? The value that is given to a contract, right? This could be either monetary value, it could be an action, right? Some form of a benefit, right? So basically, in simple terms, a consideration is in the form of a benefit, right, to a party, right? So this was defined in the case called Curie versus Misa. Um, so in this case, they've defined consideration. This is one of the basic cases. Like if you all are answering a question on consideration, this has to be your starting point. So this should be your first sort of definition on consideration. So in this case, they've basically defined consideration as sort of like a benefit that is given to one party, while another party could obviously bear like sort of like a forbearance. So what this basically means is when we go into a contract, right? Uh, Either both parties could benefit or one party could benefit and the other party could maybe suffer a loss, right? So even a loss could be a consideration, right? Let's say through a contract, you're prevented from doing something. Let's say through a contract, you're not allowed to leave the house or something. Again, something like that is again a loss on your part, and by bearing that loss, that is also a form of consideration, right? It's not always a benefit on a party. It could be a loss as well, right? So so that's something important to note, right? When it comes to questions, they could ask you, right? There could be an instance where a certain action is sort of a loss to a party. Even if it's a loss to the party, that still could amount to a consideration, right? In the context of English law, right? In the context of English law, right? So consideration differs from another concept called justa causa, which I'll come later on in the discussion. But when it comes to consideration, it includes a benefit or a loss, right? So this case that I mentioned, which came under English law, was later recognized under Sri Lankan law as well. So it's applicable in Sri Lanka as well, right? So I'll send this note on the group, but um, like just basically the basic idea of of consideration is that it's either a benefit or a loss that is incurred by a party, right? It could be both parties or it could be one party, right? In a contract, right? So like Isuru said, when it comes to an offer, right? When a party makes an offer, right? It's in a way similar to a promise, right? Um, so I wouldn't say it's definitely a promise, but not all promises are valid, right, or enforceable. The reason why a promise becomes enforceable is through this element of consideration. So if you promise to do something, there should be a consideration attached to it. Now, for an example, let's say there's two parties, A and B, and A wants to buy B's car, right? So A will promise to buy B's car at, let's say, 2 million. So 2 million is your consideration. While on the side of B, B will promise to give the car when he receives the 2 million, right? So the 2 million is the consideration there. So let's say if this promise just went about, right? Let's say you were just asking for the car, right? Okay. Let's say you went and said, "Can I take this car for a week?" Right? Or something of that sort. And then you don't give a consideration or you don't give a benefit to B, uh, if you're getting the car from B, then that wouldn't mean that that wouldn't amount to an enforceable contract, right? Why? Because there's no benefit for B, right? There should be a benefit for B, right? He's giving away his property or something of that. Let's say he gives away, by giving away his car, he can't use that car for a week, right? So there is a loss on his part, right? But for that loss, he's not given a benefit, right? So when there's no mutual benefit or mutual loss shared by the parties, that wouldn't amount to an enforceable promise, right? So that's one of the reasons why contracts, not all promises will become contracts, right? Because um, because all promises would not entail consideration. So that's why consideration is very important, and it should be mutual, like I said, right? So when there's a benefit for one party, the other party should also gain some sort of a benefit, right? You give the car, you get 2 million, right? So both parties benefit, right? So that's consideration. So it's very mutual, right? Um, so there's also another important case called Dunlop versus Selfridge Limited. This case basically gives you the idea, right? What I just mentioned. So one party's actions, right? One party's action should be the price for which the promise of the other is bought. So basically, like I said, uh, one party giving the car, and if he gets 2 million, that 2 million is your consideration. That is the price you pay for the promise of giving the car, right? The promise is giving the car, you get 2 million. The 2 million is the price you pay for that promise to be fulfilled. So that's your consideration, right? Um, is that part clear? That's the basic meaning of consideration. Any questions, guys? If you all have questions, like put it on the chat. If you all want me to explain it simply, or if it's too fast again, you all can put it on the chat, right? So it's basically always mutual, right? So one party cannot necessarily, now when it comes to consideration, we'll discuss later. The benefit doesn't have to be equal on, right? It doesn't have to be equal on both parties. As long as a party has some sort of benefit, that is sufficient, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be it has to be mutual, but does not necessarily have to be equal, right? So keep that in mind as well as we go into the discussion, right? So then when it comes to consideration, now this is, I think Isuru discussed this a bit. So we discussed about unilateral and bilateral contracts, right? So because of unilateral and bilateral contracts, consideration is also divided into two types, right? So firstly, we have executed consideration. So this is basically where consideration is provided when the contract is formed, right? Or when the contract is eventually completed, right? Let's say for an example, right? The Carbolic Smoke Bar Company case, right? Carlyle versus Carbolic Smoke Bar Company. So in that case, basically like the whole issue was um, with obviously the person being contracted by the disease, right? That was the condition, or that was the performance, right? So if she had contracted the disease, uh, she would be eligible for the reward, right? So now, for that performance to take place, right? Now you put up a poster, uh, and based on that poster, you do something, the performance. Once that performance is done, you receive the consideration. So the consideration is received when you do something, right? Meaning the contract comes to an end, right? I mean, you've performed what is required. So at the performance, if you get something, that is called executed consideration. You get the consideration at the end of the contract. Basically, once performance is fulfilled. The best example apart from that could be like when it comes to like dispatching goods, right? Let's say a customer orders something and you receive the order, right? You go and you deliver, let's say a person orders vegetables, right? A person from Colombo orders vegetables from let's say Ratnapura, right? So from Ratnapura, let's say a person receives that order, he will come from Ratnapura to Colombo and deliver the vegetables to the customer, right? When it's delivered, you receive the consideration, right? So when it's delivered, that's performance of your part, meaning there is acceptance, and then a contract is formed, right? And that concludes the contract, right? You get what you wanted from from let's say the retailer, right? So when it's performed, you give him money, right? So that's basically an executed consideration. When you execute the consideration, you get the money, right? The consideration is, sorry, when you execute or when you execute or basically the performance, when the performance is completed, you receive the consideration. So that normally happens in unilateral contracts. Like Isuru said, unilateral contracts are where it's universal, right? You just put up like a reward notice or something of that sorts. When you put it out there, anyone can perform it and anyone can perform it and create a contract, right? So in unilateral contracts, this is what normally happens, right? Uh, you put out, let's say, a reward notice, and then the performance is done, then you get the consideration. So that's executed consideration, right? Um, then you have executory consideration. So this is basically to do with sort of actions that move into the future. So let's say in a contract, let's say it's a bilateral contract, right? Let's say some part of the contract is left to be completed in the future, right? Then your consideration is executed. Why? Because when you make the consideration, the contract is not yet concluded, right? There is a certain part of the contract to be fulfilled, right? Let's say for an example, let's say you go to a car wash, right? And you uh, pay at the very start. Let's say you go into a car wash and you want to get your car cleaned and wax and all of that. You pay at the very outset, right? You go in, you pay, right? Now, at the time you paid, right, there is a contract form, right? But the performance takes place later, right? The car is washed and clean and all of that happens later on, right? So when that happens later on, right, there is always a bilateral promise, right? It's a bilateral contract. Why? You give money and you expect that person to clean the vehicle, right? So those are bilateral contracts where both parties have some part to play. So in that sort of a situation, uh, normally when there's something left to be completed, those type of considerations are called executory consideration. Where when the consideration is exchanged, there is still a part of the contract to be concluded. So that's called an executory contract, executory consideration, basically. So that's part of bilateral contracts, right? So basically, if you all did like understand the difference between unilateral and bilateral, then it's easier, right? So in unilateral, performance takes place when the contract is formed, right? So then the consideration is passed at the point of concluding the contract, basically, right? When you're done with everything. Executory, where it's a bilateral contract, is where both parties have to do something, right? So when it's bilateral, there's always an element left for the future, right? A party has to do something in the future. So consideration is passed earlier, right? So that's an executory consideration, right? So that's the difference between those are the basic two types of consideration. Any questions until that point? I haven't gotten any questions yet. If you all have any questions, just drop a message, right? If it's unclear or if you all need much more simple explanation, just drop a message, right? So those are basically the two types of consideration, and now we are moving into the rules of consideration. Now, for consideration in a promise or in a contract to be valid, there are certain rules that have to be complied with, right? Um, so, in rules in the sense, basically, like there are certain limitations that are provided to ensure that not everything becomes consideration, right? There are certain ground rules, right? And requisites that are to be fulfilled. So, we've identified five main requisites, right? The first thing is the consideration has to move from the promisee. Right now, this rule um, is basically ensures that the contract only takes place between the parties of the contract, right? So I think Isuru, no, so there's a concept. Um, so in contracts, normally we consider it's called the doctrine of privity. If you all can see, it's this part here. It's called the doctrine of privity. So what that means is basically in a contract, uh, only the parties of the contract are able to enforce it, right? Only the parties of the contract. That's basically, let's say, the offeror, the offeree, right? The parties of the contract are able to enforce it. So that's the basic idea of this rule, right? So the consideration in a contract should be passed by these parties, right? You can't allow like a third party to come and like, let's say, intervene into matters of a contract without them sort of, let's say, having any interest, right? Now, let's say if there was a minor involved in the contract, you can ask someone else to file action for him, right? But if that's not the case, someone else can't just come and like, file action against the party, right? So this doctrine of privity is something that's sort of maintained in contract law, and it's something that's embodied in this rule as well. So um, only the parties of the contract can give the consideration, right? Can pass consideration between each other.